They called it madness. When Hitler's tanks swept through Europe in 1939, most of the world watched in disbelief. Poland fell in weeks, France in days. German generals promised a new era of mechanized war, lightning war, or Blitzkrieg, a doctrine that fused speed, coordination, and shock into something that seemed unstoppable. But on the other side of the continent, in Moscow, Soviet commanders looked at the same spectacle and quietly refused to follow. They studied the German advance, its brilliance, its precision, and then rejected it entirely. They would not build their war on speed. They would not chase victory through motion. Instead, they prepared for something much darker, a war of endurance, depth, and sacrifice. It was a choice that confused even their allies. Yet somehow, against the very army that invented Blitzkrieg, it was the Soviets who would emerge victorious. The paradox begins here. How could an army that seemed slower, more rigid, and far less sophisticated defeat the most advanced military machine of its time? The answer lies not in ideology or numbers alone, but in doctrine, in how the Soviets reimagined the very nature of warfare. To understand it, we have to go back to the 1930s, when both Germany and the USSR were quietly experimenting with the same idea: deep mechanized operations. At Kazan, near Moscow, Soviet officers even trained alongside German tank crews under secret cooperation agreements signed after World War I. Both sides dreamed of breaking through enemy lines with armored columns and aircraft, but they drew different lessons from that dream. For Germany, Blitzkrieg was about rapid collapse, the psychological destruction of an enemy before numbers could matter. For the Soviets, whose territory stretched across 11 time zones, the idea of a quick war was a fantasy. Stalin's generals, men like Tukhachevsky and Trandafilov, envisioned not lightning strikes, but deep operations. Waves of mechanized attacks designed to grind the enemy down layer by layer. Their plan wasn't elegant, it wasn't fast, but it was built for a world war, a conflict of attrition, geography, and sheer industrial scale. Ironically, the Soviets had their own early Blitzkrieg theorist in Mikhail Tukhachevsky. He advocated massive armored formations supported by air power and mechanized infantry, ideas remarkably close to what the Germans would later perfect. But Stalin's Great Purge in 1937 wiped out this generation of thinkers. Tukhachevsky was executed, his doctrine denounced as unrealistic.
Die Rote Armee enterte 1941 desorientiert, strippt von des besten Mainz und bürdet mit rigider Hierarchie. Wenn Hitler launchte Operation Barbarossa, es lugte wie Blitzkrieg hatte alleins prüfen die Sowjets wrong. Panzers raced hundreds of kilometers in days. Entire Soviet armies wurden encircelt an Minsk, Smolensk und Kiew. Tanks wie der Panzer III. Und IV., armed mit 50 mm und Short 75 mm Guns, cut durch obsolete Sowjet-BTs und T-26. Die Luftwaffe destrodierte Tausende von Aircraft on the ground. Everything the Soviets had feared about Blitzkrieg seemed to be happening. But underneath the chaos, something unexpected was forming. Ein learning process unlike anything Germany had planned for. In den ersten Monaten Sowjet Commanders realisierten, dass trying to imitate Blitzkrieg war Suizid.
Their communications were slower, their logistics weaker, and their industrial centers still relocating east. They couldn't match German coordination or tempo. So instead of chasing the same ideal, they adapted. Every defeat became an experiment. Units that survived encirclement began to focus not on mobility, but resilience. By late 1941, Soviet doctrine quietly shifted from maneuver to depth. Instead of concentrating everything in the front line, they layered their defense. Multiple echelons of infantry, artillery, and tanks designed to absorb the German thrust and then counterattack once momentum broke. It was the inverse of Blitzkrieg, not fast destruction, but controlled exhaustion. When the Germans advanced, they faced fresh reserves hidden behind the front. When they broke through, Soviet commanders closed the gap with reinforcements from depth. And when winter came, the logic of Blitzkrieg, built on movement and clear weather, turned against the invaders. Engines froze, supply lines collapsed, and speed lost meaning. Yet this wasn't just a triumph of nature. It was doctrine reshaping reality. In December 1941, as the Red Army counterattacked outside Moscow, Soviet mechanized units moved not in reckless pursuit, but in coordinated phases. Artillery, armor, and infantry layered like gears in a single machine. It wasn't graceful, but it worked. The Germans, designed for short bursts, couldn't sustain prolonged combat. Blitzkrieg had no plan for an enemy who refused to die quickly. The irony deepened in 1942. German commanders like Guderian and Manstein still believed in decisive operations, that one perfect strike could end the war. The Soviets, by contrast, no longer believed in decisive battles at all. They believed in cumulative ones. Each failed counterattack, each lost city, was part of a larger process, bleeding the Wehrmacht over distance and time. This shift in mindset would lead directly to the turning point of Stalingrad. By rejecting Blitzkrieg, the Soviets weren't surrendering speed. They were redefining victory. They built an army meant not to strike hardest, but to outlast. And as the snow fell over the Volga, that difference began to show. By the winter of 1942, the Red Army was fighting a war its early planners could scarcely have imagined. Entire cities were now fortresses, entire rivers defensive lines. The German Blitzkrieg, built to annihilate enemies in weeks, had stalled in a landscape designed to swallow it whole. At Stalingrad, the paradox became flesh. Speed had turned into stillness, mobility into entrapment. The Wehrmacht's tanks, once the spearheads of lightning war, were now trapped in frozen streets, their engines choking on the cold, their crews surrounded by a new kind of army, one that had learned to let the storm burn itself out. The Soviet generals who directed the counteroffensive at Stalingrad, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, were not improvising in chaos. They were executing the very principle that had replaced Blitzkrieg, deep operations. Operation Uranus, launched in November 1942, struck not at the city itself, but at the flanks, the weaker Romanian and Italian armies guarding the German sides. It was a maneuver of envelopment, not breakthrough. Soviet mechanized corps, backed by Katyusha rocket batteries and thousands of T-34 tanks, didn't try to move faster than the Germans. They moved smarter, enveloping them in layers of steel and artillery fire. The result was not a dazzling thrust, but a slow tightening, a noose that closed day by day until the Sixth Army was cut off completely. In that moment, the myth of Blitzkrieg died. It wasn't destroyed by superior firepower or better tanks, but by doctrine, by an enemy that refused to fight by the same rules. The Germans had engineered a system that demanded perfect conditions: coordinated radio networks, endless fuel, rapid repair lines. The Soviets built a system that thrived in imperfection. They could lose cities and divisions and still fight. They could trade space for time and time for strength. Blitzkrieg required precision. The Soviet method required endurance. And endurance was what they had in infinite supply. From 1943 onward, Soviet strategy shifted again, from survival to momentum. The Red Army, now fully industrialized and rebuilt in the Urals, began producing tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Factories in Nizhny Tagil and Chelyabinsk, known as Tankograd, rolled out thousands of T-34s each month. The weapon itself became a symbol of the doctrine: simple, durable, repairable in the field. Unlike the German Panther or Tiger, masterpieces of engineering that often broke down, the T-34 was built to survive punishment and keep moving. It was, in a way, the anti-Blitzkrieg tank. When Soviet columns rolled west in 1943, they didn't move as the Germans had, with lightning thrusts and narrow corridors, but in waves. The Kursk defensive plan in July 1943 was the clearest demonstration of this philosophy. Expecting a German offensive, the Soviets constructed 8 defensive belts across 300 kilometers. Trenches, minefields, anti-tank guns, and reserve lines in depth. The Germans struck with their new Tigers and Panthers, the apex of Blitzkrieg design. But each time they broke through, they found another line waiting. Blitzkrieg's power to shock was neutralized by redundancy. The Soviet counterattack at Kursk, Operation Kutuzov, didn't rely on surprise or speed. It relied on inevitability. Once the German offensive exhausted itself, the Red Army unleashed its mechanized reserves, striking into the flanks and rear of the enemy's spearheads. The result was not a single brilliant moment, but a slow collapse. By September, the Germans were retreating for good. The Soviets had mastered a kind of warfare that turned attrition into strategy. Behind this shift was something deeper than tactics. It was a philosophical inversion of war itself. Blitzkrieg treated war as a short, decisive contest between elites, the best tanks, the best pilots, the best timing. The Soviet doctrine treated war as a total social process. It was fought not just with soldiers, but with factories, farmers, and railways. Generals like Zhukov and Konev coordinated not just divisions, but supply corridors, rail networks, and industrial output. Logistics became a weapon. This mindset had echoes even in the smallest details. Soviet machine gunners, for instance, often preferred heavier, slower systems like the SG-43 or later the PKM, weapons that could fire continuously without overheating, unlike the high-rate German MG-42, which, while lethal, demanded constant barrel changes and precision manufacturing. It was the same contrast one could later see between the M60 machine gun in Vietnam and the more reliable M240 that replaced it. One prized rate of fire, the other durability. Soviet engineers instinctively chose the latter path long before NATO did. In the ruins of Stalingrad and Kursk, this philosophy hardened into a permanent truth. Wars are not won by brilliance alone. They are won by systems that can absorb failure. By rejecting Blitzkrieg, Soviet generals had created a doctrine that could not be killed by defeat, and by 1944, that doctrine was about to roll across Europe. By 1944, the Red Army was no longer the chaotic, disorganized force that had stumbled in 1941. It was now a machine of staggering depth, millions of men, tens of thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and an industrial base that dwarfed anything Germany could sustain. Yet its power was not merely in numbers. It was in the coherence of its doctrine. The Soviets had built what the Germans could never replicate, an operational system capable of absorbing loss and regenerating momentum. Every offensive, every retreat, every river crossed was a calculated exchange of endurance for opportunity. Operation Bagration in June 1944 revealed this transformation in full. While Western observers often focus on D-Day, Bagration was, by every measure, the greater military catastrophe for Nazi Germany. Within 2 months, the Red Army annihilated Army Group Center, over 500,000 German soldiers gone. It was not achieved through surprise alone, but through the perfection of the Soviet deep battle method. The offensive began with massive artillery barrages that crippled command posts and communications, followed by coordinated breakthroughs by mechanized and infantry formations moving along multiple axes. What looked to the Germans like chaos was in fact design. Instead of narrow, elegant thrusts like Blitzkrieg, Soviet commanders created operational swarms, overlapping advances that prevented the enemy from reforming a coherent defense. When one axis stalled, another surged forward. This elastic, layered approach made Blitzkrieg obsolete. The Germans had relied on perfect timing between tanks, planes, and infantry. The Soviets overwhelmed timing itself. They struck on a scale that no human commander could fully control, and that was the point.
By this stage, Soviet planning embraced what modern analysts might call systems warfare. Every element, air, armor, artillery, logistics, was synchronized not by intuition, but by mathematics. The Red Army's artillery preparation before major offensives was timed to the second. Entire divisions moved according to railway schedules drawn up months in advance. Commanders like Zhukov didn't need to gamble on a single decisive strike. They could unleash overwhelming, continuous pressure until the enemy collapsed. It was a form of warfare that cared little for elegance and everything for inevitability. In the West, Allied commanders marveled and sometimes recoiled at the scale of Soviet operations. American officers, accustomed to tactical flexibility, found Soviet rigidity unnerving. But what they misunderstood was that beneath the rigidity lay adaptation. The Red Army was nicht slow because it was primitive, it was deliberate because it had learned that survival demanded control. Wer Blitzkrieg treibt on chaos, the Soviet doctrine domesticated it. Even Soviet technology reflected this ethos. The T-34 remained the backbone of armored units, but it was now joined by the IS-2 heavy tank, armed with einem massiven 122 mm gun. Slower to reload, but devastating gegen Fortifikationen und Tiger-Tanks alike. Soviet aircraft wie die IL-2 Sturmovik, called die Flying Tank, wurden built zu Widerstand Punishment und operieren close to ground troops. Each design choice followed dieselbe Prinzip: simplicity, survivability, repeatability. Nothing wasted, nothing fragile. Deutsche Technologie bei 1944 hat bekannt das Gegenteil. Over-engineered, underproduced, and strategically unsustainable. The Tiger II, for instance, could dominate a battlefield, but only if it reached it. Many broke down before combat. The Panther's high-velocity gun and complex suspension demanded precision manufacturing that Germany's bombed factories could no longer guarantee. The Soviets had no such problem. They produced more T-34s than the Germans produced all tank models combined. But raw quantity alone doesn't explain the outcome. The key was tempo, not speed in the Blitzkrieg sense, but operational rhythm. Soviet offensives moved like tides. Preparation, breakthrough, exploitation, regroup, repeat. Each phase fed the next. When German units counterattacked, they found themselves fighting not one battle, but a rolling sequence of them. Each success only led to another encirclement. Blitzkrieg's focus on shock had no answer to this. Shock fades, rhythm endures. By the time the Red Army crossed into Poland and later into East Prussia, it was applying this rhythm with surgical precision. The Vistula-Oder offensive in early 1945 moved 300 miles in less than a month, but it wasn't lightning war. It was methodical annihilation, artillery corridors, coordinated logistics, and relentless pursuit. Soviet soldiers advanced behind an ocean of fire. By then, even German generals admitted privately that they no longer faced Asiatic hordes, as propaganda once called them, but a modern, scientific army whose methods were terrifyingly efficient. And within that efficiency was a moral dimension, one born from unimaginable loss. More than 20 million Soviet lives had been consumed by the war. Every advance carried the memory of those who hadn't returned. The doctrine of depth was not just military, it was psychological. It reflected a nation conditioned to absorb pain, to keep moving forward even when the cost was unbearable. In rejecting Blitzkrieg, Soviet generals had created a war machine powered not by genius, but by endurance. And endurance, they learned, could defeat genius itself. But the lessons of that rejection would not fade with the end of the war. Because even after the guns fell silent, the philosophy that had beaten Blitzkrieg would evolve, shaping how the world prepared for every conflict that came after. When Berlin fell in May 1945, it seemed the story was complete. A brutal empire destroyed by its own overreach, and a nation once nearly annihilated now standing triumphant amid the ruins. But the deeper legacy of that victory was not simply military, it was doctrinal. By rejecting Blitzkrieg, Soviet generals had reinvented modern warfare itself, turning defeat into a laboratory for endurance, and that legacy would echo across the next half-century. The Western Allies ended the war still believing in precision, command, and maneuver, in the idea that wars could be won through technology and timing. The Soviets came away with a different lesson, that survival demanded depth, redundancy, and system-wide control. It was this philosophy that built the post-war Red Army, an organization that prized structure over improvisation and mass over elegance. Its divisions were arranged in echelons like the layers of a defensive wall, each capable of absorbing and regenerating under fire. Where German Blitzkrieg sought to compress war into a single decisive moment, the Soviets stretched it across time itself. That thinking shaped the entire Cold War. Soviet strategists such as Marshal Ogarkov and later Akhromeyev refined deep battle theory into operational art, blending logistics, mobility, and attrition into a single machine of total war. Their war games simulated not weeks, but months of sustained conflict against NATO. Soviet tanks like the T-55, T-62, and T-72 followed the same pattern as the T-34 before them. Not the fastest or the most advanced, but simple to maintain, easy to mass produce, and rugged enough to operate in deserts or snowfields. Even small arms reflected that ethos. The AK-47, like the T-34, was built for survival, not finesse. In this sense, every Soviet weapon became a quiet rebuttal to Blitzkrieg's obsession with perfection. It's ironic that NATO's later doctrine, especially after Vietnam, began to adopt elements of that same endurance logic. The U.S. M60 machine gun, for example, once celebrated for its firepower, proved unreliable in long engagements, jamming under mud and heat. It was replaced by the M240, a slower but far more durable design that favored sustained fire over raw speed. The shift mirrored, decades later, what Soviet engineers had learned the hard way. Reliability outlives brilliance. The same truth echoed in armored warfare. Western militaries discovered that maintaining a few superior tanks was less effective than deploying many good ones that could stay operational, the very logic of Soviet mass production. Yet behind all the steel and calculation was a human truth. The rejection of Blitzkrieg wasn't born of genius alone. It came from loss, catastrophic, generational loss. Millions of soldiers and civilians had been consumed by the early German onslaught, and from that devastation emerged a doctrine that refused to trust luck ever again. Soviet generals planned as if chaos were inevitable, as if every victory had to survive its own disaster. That pessimism, paradoxically, became their strength. They built a system that assumed breakdown, and therefore could not be broken. This is why, even in Afghanistan, decades later, remnants of the old Soviet mindset persisted. Operations were conducted in depth, methodical, coordinated, sometimes painfully slow. To Western observers, it looked like inertia. To those who had inherited Zhukov's logic, it was control, the assurance that no single failure could unravel the whole. Whether it worked or not in that distant war was another matter. But the lineage of thought was clear. Never again trust the illusion of lightning war. When we look back now, the rejection of Blitzkrieg seems almost inevitable, as if history itself demanded balance. The Germans had sought to compress war into moments of pure brilliance. The Soviets stretched it into a test of civilization's capacity to endure. One was a flash, the other a furnace. And inside that furnace, something unplanned happened. The evolution of a doctrine that, by sheer stubbornness, redefined power itself. In the end, Blitzkrieg promised victory through momentum,
But it could not sustain that promise once the world turned to fire and ruin. The Soviet approach, born from humiliation and fear, endured because it accepted the limits of human control. It traded glory for survival, motion for patience, genius for system.
And perhaps that is the final paradox of all war innovation, that the most effective strategies are not those that dazzle, but those that endure. The story of the Red Army's rejection of Blitzkrieg is not just the tale of one war's outcome. It's a reminder of how nations learn under fire, how ideas forged in desperation can outlast the weapons that carried them. It teaches that technology, no matter how brilliant, is meaningless without a structure that can bear failure. That resilience, not speed, is what wins in the end. Because when the fires of war fade and the noise of engines dies, what remains is not the flash of victory, but the endurance of those who refuse to break. And in that silence, the lesson stands. Blitzkrieg burned bright, but the Soviets, by standing still, outlasted the storm.